In the mid-16th century, Europe was living through a troubled time. The wounds left by the Protestant Reformation still bled in the soul of Christendom, and the Church sought to restore the unity shaken by divisions and heresies. In this turbulent context, God raised up men of extraordinary faith to restore holiness and ecclesiastical discipline. Among them, a figure stood out for his impressive vigor, refined intelligence, and profound spirituality: Saint Charles Borromeo. Born on October 2nd, 1538, in the castle of Arona on the shores of Lake Maggiore in Italy, Charles belonged to the noble Borromeo family of Milanese origin, known for its influence and fidelity to the Church. From early on, Providence prepared him to be a beacon of holiness within the Catholic hierarchy, a pastor dedicated to the salvation of souls in one of the most difficult periods in the history of the Church. Charles's childhood was marked by piety and a sense of duty. While other young men his age allowed themselves to be seduced by the comforts of nobility, he showed a natural inclination toward prayer and study. His education was guided by a deep love for Catholic doctrine, transmitted by his family and reinforced by his own desire to serve God. From a young age, Charles displayed a rare sensitivity for spiritual things. He would spend hours before a small oratory in his room and already spoke of consecrating himself to the service of the Church. This early ardor was the sign of a chosen soul. Even surrounded by luxury and power, he preserved a sincere humility, refusing to be corrupted by the privileges of his position. His family life was marked by an exemplary balance between study, devotion, and service to others, which would later make him a model of priestly virtue. Upon reaching youth, Charles was sent to study canon and civil law at the University of Pavia, one of the most prestigious of the time. There he proved to be a brilliant, disciplined student, deeply aware of his ecclesiastical vocation. While many classmates let themselves be carried away by philosophical debates or worldly pleasures, Borromeo saw in legal studies an instrument to better serve the Church. He understood that true knowledge ought to be at the service of faith and charity. At 22, he graduated with distinction and was immediately called to Rome by his uncle, Cardinal Giovanni Angelo Medici, who, in 1559, would be elected Pope Pius IV. The young Borromeo, with his prudence and zeal, would soon become one of the pontiff's principal collaborators, exercising administrative roles of enormous responsibility within the Roman Curia. In the Roman environment, filled with political intrigues and theological challenges, Charles Borromeo stood out for his integrity and discernment. Appointed Cardinal and Archbishop of Milan while still very young, he was not dazzled by the prestige that accompanied such offices. On the contrary, he saw in them a cross and a mission. While many sought honors, he sought souls. His heart burned with the desire to reform the clergy, instruct the people, and restore the holiness of ecclesiastical life. It was during this period that he played a crucial role in the conclusion of the Council of Trent, contributing decisively to the application of its reforms. Providence placed him exactly where the Church most needed him, at the heart of the process of spiritual and moral renewal that would mark post-Tridentine Catholicism. The Council of Trent, begun in 1545 and concluded in 1563, was the most important event of the Church in the 16th century. Its aim was to respond to Protestant heresies and to promote a profound internal reform. Saint Charles Borromeo, though young, became one of the central figures in the implementation of the conciliar decisions. Endowed with an impressive doctrinal clarity and a burning zeal for the truth, he understood that the Church could only truly be renewed if her ministers returned to holiness of life. Thus, his pastoral and reforming action was guided by total fidelity to the definitions of the Council, which he sought to apply with vigor in all the dioceses under his responsibility. His life became a living reflection of the Tridentine spirit, combining doctrinal rigor with apostolic ardor. After the council, Charles Borromeo firmly assumed the mission of applying the reforms in his archdiocese of Milan, one of the most important in Italy. Upon arriving in the city, he found a disorganized clergy, abandoned seminaries, and a population that had long lacked spiritual direction. Undaunted, he began a deep pastoral reform. He founded seminaries for the formation of priests, personally visited forgotten parishes, re-established ecclesiastical discipline, and vigorously combated the abuses and corruption that had infiltrated religious life. His action was energetic, but always guided by charity. He did not seek to punish out of vanity, but to correct out of love. He saw reform not as an external imposition, but as an interior conversion, a sincere return to the gospel. The figure of Saint Charles Borromeo began to stand out not only as a reformer, but as a true pastor of souls. His zeal was tireless. He traveled through the diocese on horseback, facing dangerous roads and bad weather just to visit a small parish or comfort a group of peasants. In each visit, he left a trail of faith and hope. He preached with simplicity and depth, reminding the faithful that holiness was not the privilege of monks or priests, but a universal vocation. His example drew crowds. People saw in him a man of God, someone who united authority and humility in a harmonious way. His presence inspired confidence, and his word converted hearts. In addition to his reforms and pastoral visits, Charles Borromeo also stood out for his charity toward the poor. He distributed his personal goods to help those in need and encouraged the faithful to do the same. When a terrible plague ravaged Milan, he neither fled nor isolated himself in safety, as many did. On the contrary, he went out into the streets, visiting the sick, bringing the Blessed Sacrament to the dying, and organizing makeshift hospitals. The city saw in him a true shepherd who gave his life for his sheep. His courage and compassion turned tragedy into an occasion of faith. While many succumbed to fear, he radiated hope. That time of trial revealed the greatness of his soul and sealed his fame for holiness. The spirituality of Saint Charles Borromeo was deeply rooted in the Eucharist and in the cross. He spent long hours before the Blessed Sacrament, often in tears, asking for strength to lead his people. The Mass was the center of his life, and from it, he drew the energy necessary for his works. He was also a man of penance. He slept little, ate simply, and imposed rigorous fasts upon himself, not out of ascetical pride, but out of love. He saw mortification as a way to unite himself more fully to Christ and to purify his heart of every earthly attachment. His austerity, far from driving people away, attracted them, for all saw in him an authentic witness of holiness lived in the everyday reality of mission. Popular devotion soon began to grow around his figure. The faithful saw him as a new Saint Paul, and tireless pastor who placed the love of Christ above all things. Even among his opponents, there were those who recognized his integrity and wisdom. The fame of his holiness crossed the borders of Milan and reached Rome, where the Pope regarded him as the ideal model of a Tridentine bishop. Saint Charles Borromeo not only reformed structures, but rekindled the flame of faith. His life demonstrated that the true reform of the Church begins with personal conversion and is made concrete in pastoral love. In a time of confusion and division, he was a beacon of unity and fidelity to the truth. In the end, the figure of Saint Charles Borromeo symbolizes the rebirth of the Catholic Church in the post-Reformation period. His witness was a reminder that holiness and discipline are inseparable, and that true authority is exercised in service and sacrifice. He showed that a bishop must be at once pastor and father, teacher and servant, administrator and saint. His life and work remained a luminous example for all later generations. What began as a mission of reform became a path of personal sanctification. Saint Charles Borromeo was, above all, a man of God, whose light continues to shine centuries later, illuminating the path of those who seek to serve the Church with fidelity and love. Upon assuming the governance of the archdiocese of Milan, Saint Charles Borromeo found a desolate spiritual reality. The city, though prosperous and cultured, had drifted away from living faith. The clergy, for the most part, were lax. Many priests lived without adequate formation and with little awareness of the sacred ministry they exercised. Parishes were abandoned, monasteries neglected, and the people plunged into religious ignorance. Milan urgently needed a pastor with courage and apostolic zeal. It was in this setting that the young archbishop began his reforming mission, determined to restore the dignity of the priesthood and the purity of Christian life. His arrival at the Milanese cathedral was like a new wind blowing over the Lombard plain, rekindling hope and faith. From the very first moment, Borromeo showed that he would not be a distant administrator, but a present pastor. He personally visited each community, traveling through villages, mountains, and fields to get to know the flock God had entrusted to him. In his pastoral visits, he carefully observed the situation of the churches, schools, and convents, noting everything that needed to be corrected. He did not limit himself to sending orders. He himself set the example. He gathered the clergy, preached with ardor, and convened synods to reform customs and revive discipline. Many were startled by his rigor, but soon understood that he did not seek power, but holiness. His authority sprang from the coherence between what he preached and what he lived. The reform he undertook was deep and far-reaching. Saint Charles knew that it was not enough to impose rules, it was necessary to form souls. Therefore, he founded seminaries to prepare holy and learned priests according to the norms of the Council of Trent. In these seminaries, spiritual life held first place. Daily prayer, study of sacred scripture, devotion to the Most Holy Virgin, and observance of celibacy were non-negotiable pillars. He desired that each priest be a mirror of Christ, and for this he required an irreproachable moral life. He taught that the priest must be the first to convert, the first to become holy, for the salvation of many souls would depend on his holiness. His concern for simple people was equally moving. Borromeo understood that religious ignorance was one of the greatest wounds of the Church. Therefore, he encouraged catechesis, ordered accessible catechisms to be printed, and promoted Christian instruction in the parishes. He organized confraternities and parish schools where children and adults learned the fundamentals of the Catholic faith. He encouraged frequent confession and participation in Holy Mass. His pastoral action was at once firm and affectionate, paternal and demanding. He knew that true charity is not indulgence toward error, but loving guidance to the truth. His presence was like a flame that purified and illuminated, awakening slumbering hearts. The life of Saint Charles followed an almost superhuman rhythm. He worked incessantly, slept few hours, and spent long nights in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. He used to say that a pastor should not seek rest while there are souls in danger. Even when his health began to weaken, he did not reduce his pace. "I prefer to die working than to live idle," he would say serenely. His interior life sustained his exterior strength. From prayer, he drew the energy to face the resistances that inevitably arose. And they were not few. Many clerics, accustomed to negligence, reacted with hostility to his reforms. However, Borromeo endured everything with patience, offering his pains in reparation for the sins of the people. One of the most striking episodes of his life occurred during the plague that devastated Milan in 1576. While the nobles fled and civil authorities took refuge, Saint Charles remained in the city, becoming a true martyr of charity. He organized hospitals, distributed food, cared for the sick, and carried the Eucharist to the dying. To protect the faithful from contagion, he had outdoor altars erected, from which he celebrated Holy Mass before the crowds. In penitential processions, he walked barefoot through the streets, carrying a cross and imploring divine mercy. His figure, enveloped in prayer and courage, was engraved in the memory of the entire city. The plague passed, and faith was reborn with greater vigor than before. During those years of trial, Saint Charles became the symbol of the true pastor who does not abandon his sheep. His dedication moved even the most hardened. The people began to call him Father of the Poor and Angel of the Plague. His courage, however, did not come from recklessness, but from absolute trust in providence. He said that death, for one who lives in a state of grace, is not a punishment, but a passage to eternity. With this spirit, he faced danger with serenity and prayed for those who succumbed. The plague revealed what was already clear to those who knew him. Borromeo did not merely preach the gospel, he lived it in fullness, even in the midst of pain and risk. The deep spirituality that sustained Saint Charles was marked by a fervent devotion to the cross. He saw in suffering a means of purification and union with Christ. He often meditated on the Passion and encouraged his priests to do the same. In his pastoral letters, he wrote that the reform of the Church begins at the feet of the crucified. This mystical vision explained his serenity in the face of difficulties. Everything he did, his reforms, his penances, his preaching, sprang from love for the crucified Jesus. He was a man who carried the weight of souls in his heart and offered every tear as a silent intercession. His cross was not a symbol, but a lived reality. Over time, his reforms began to bear fruit. The clergy of Milan was transformed. The seminaries flourished, and the people rediscovered the beauty of the sacraments. The diocese became a model for other regions of Europe. Rome recognized the success of his work and pointed to him as an example for bishops throughout the world. Saint Charles Borromeo proved that pastoral holiness is not a distant ideal, but an urgent necessity of the Church. His name became synonymous with fidelity and zeal. Even in the face of calumnies and misunderstandings, he remained firm, always repeating, "The truth of Christ does not change, even when the world rejects it." The fame of his holiness crossed the boundaries of Milan and reached the highest circles of Christendom. Popes, kings, and prelates consulted him in search of counsel. He, however, remained humble, aware that all came from God. He said that the true merit of a bishop does not lie in his works, but in his obedience to the divine will. This humility was the key to his strength. Despite his position and influence, he lived simply, dressed modestly, and avoided every kind of luxury. His austerity contrasted with the splendor of Renaissance courts, but revealed a greater beauty, that of evangelical poverty. At the end of this phase of his life, Saint Charles Borromeo had restored not only a diocese, but the hope of a people. Milan, once cold and disordered, had become a city of vibrant faith, with full churches and dedicated priests. The spiritual legacy he left was immense. His pastoral work would echo through the centuries, inspiring councils, reforms, and saints. He had accomplished what the Council of Trent had envisioned, a holy, learned, and faithful clergy, and all this not with speeches, but with the living example of his own existence offered as a sacrifice of love. St. Charles Borromeo understood the episcopate not as a title of honor, but as a sacred weight, a service of love that required the total gift of self. At a time when many saw the episcopal office as a step toward power, he understood it as cross and responsibility. He saw the bishop as the one who must reflect the figure of Christ the shepherd, who gives his life for his sheep. In his letters, he often said that the bishop must be the first to ascend Calvary and the last to descend. And even This profound awareness of mission made him live each day with an impressive spiritual intensity. Nothing distracted him from his main goal, to save souls and lead his church to holiness. His routine was austere and exemplary. He rose before dawn, made long, silent prayer, meditated on the scriptures, and celebrated Holy Mass with extreme devotion. The Mass, for him, was the center of all Christian life. He once stated that whoever understands the mystery of the Eucharist never again lives for himself. After Mass, he dedicated himself to assisting the faithful, especially the poor and the sick. He spent hours hearing confessions, consoling souls, and administering the sacraments. His presence was serene and fatherly, and many left transformed simply by his gaze, full of compassion. Borromeo possessed the gift of touching hearts without many words. His life spoke for itself. The way he addressed priests also revealed his fatherly spirit. He was not a distant superior, but a demanding and just friend. He wrote them letters full of tenderness and firmness, reminding them that the priest must be pure in body, prudent in speech, holy in action, and humble in heart. He promoted spiritual retreats and encouraged the daily reading of the gospel. He taught that the priest could not be merely a functionary of the altar, but a man of prayer who carries within himself the presence of Christ. His priestly vision profoundly influenced later generations and inspired models of formation that would endure for centuries. The charity of Saint Charles was a direct reflection of his union with God. He did not see the poor merely as recipients of aid, but as living sacraments of the presence of suffering Christ. He said that there is no altar more holy than the body of the poor. When he saw someone in need, he bowed in reverence, convinced that he was serving the Lord himself. He distributed food, clothing, and even what belonged to him. In times of famine, he sold personal objects and even furniture from the episcopal palace to help the destitute. His generosity knew no limits. For him, charity was the seal of true faith, and every spiritual reform had to culminate in concrete love for one's brothers and sisters. Besides being a reformer and pastor, Saint Charles Borromeo was also a born educator. He understood that ignorance was the enemy of faith and that Christian formation should begin in childhood. Therefore, he founded schools, encouraged religious instruction, and supported charitable institutions dedicated to the education of the poor. He introduced the custom of teaching the catechism in an accessible and practical way, using simple questions and answers, so that even the humblest could understand the truths of the faith. He himself, on many occasions, taught children in public squares, kneeling beside them and explaining Christ's parables. His simplicity won hearts and demonstrated the power of true evangelical humility. St. Charles's Marian devotion was deep and constant. From a young age, he had consecrated himself to the Most Holy Virgin, whom he called my mother and teacher. He had altars dedicated to Our Lady erected throughout the diocese and encouraged the Rosary as a spiritual weapon. In times of crisis, he always turned to Mary, certain that she would lead the Church to victory. He believed that the Mother of God was the perfect model of obedience and holiness, and that every priest should have her as an example. In his preaching, he often said that whoever serves Mary does not get lost. His filial trust in Our Lady was visible at every moment, and many testified to seeing in him a supernatural peace after his prayers before Marian images. Saint Charles Borromeo also cultivated a burning devotion to the Most Holy Sacrament. He was in the habit of visiting the tabernacle several times a day, kneeling in silence before the body of Christ. There he found the strength to bear the burdens of the episcopate and the wisdom to govern his diocese. He promoted Eucharistic processions and exhorted the people to adoration. For him, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist was the heart of Christian life and the antidote to spiritual lukewarmness. He once stated, The altar is the center of the universe, because from it, the life of the world flows. This conviction made him not only an efficient administrator, but a true contemplative in action. His life of prayer was accompanied by rigorous personal discipline. He practiced frequent fasts, slept on a simple bed, and wore a cilice in secret. He regarded penance as a way of conforming himself to the crucified Christ. He did not seek suffering out of vanity, but out of redeeming love. In times of abundance and luxury, his witness aroused admiration and discomfort. Many nobles criticized him, saying that a man of his position did not need to live with such austerity. He, however, replied serenely, "He who carries the cross of Christ needs no gold." His life was a silent preaching, a constant call to conversion. St. Charles's firmness in matters of faith was unshakable. Faced with heresies and misguided interpretations, he defended Catholic doctrine with clarity, yielding neither to political pressures nor theological fashions. He was fully aware that truth does not belong to man, but to God, and that it is the Church's role to guard it faithfully. Therefore, he never relativized morals or faith, even when this earned him enemies. His fidelity to the magisterium was absolute, and his voice echoed like a beacon amid the darkness of doctrinal confusions. For him, the bishop should be the wall that protects the flock against error and sin. For all these reasons, Saint Charles Borromeo became the ideal model of the Tridentine bishop, one who unites doctrine with charity, authority with humility, pastoral zeal with a life of prayer. His example inspired generations of pastors and reformers, and his name was engraved in the history of the Church as a synonym for episcopal holiness. He showed that true reform is born of personal conversion, and that every ecclesial structure only makes sense when it leads souls to Christ. His life was a continual offering, a silent holocaust consumed by the flame of divine love. As the years went by, Saint Charles Borromeo became ever more like the suffering Christ he so loved. His health, already weakened by long journeys and severe penances, began to show signs of frailty. Even so, he did not allow himself to rest. He said that the shepherd cannot sleep while the flock is exposed to wolves. Even ill, he continued to visit distant parishes, to celebrate masses, and to preach with the same intensity as in his early years. His voice, already tired, retained an unmistakable fervor. Many priests and faithful testified that it was enough to see him pray before the altar to understand what it means to love God with all one's heart. His life was a continual offering. He was not content to preach penance. He lived it in a radical way. He ate with extreme simplicity, slept little, and often spent whole nights in prayer. The austerities he imposed on himself were rigorous, but always accompanied by deep joy. He did not see mortification as punishment, but as a way of union with Christ. On one occasion, he told a young priest that the true Christian must spend himself like a candle that is consumed before the altar, illuminating others with his own flame. This sentence perfectly summarized his way of living: ardent, luminous, and willing to be consumed for the glory of God. St. Charles's fidelity to the truths of the faith became even more evident in the final years of his episcopate. He faced criticism from some quarters that considered his rigor excessive, but he remained unshakable. He accepted no concessions when it came to the purity of doctrine and morals. He strongly defended priestly celibacy, the dignity of the liturgy, and the necessity of frequent confession. For him, the Church had to be holy because her founder is holy. He rejected every form of worldliness that threatened the clergy and the faithful. His courage in defending the faith was such that even his opponents respected him. He did not fear displeasing men, for his only desire was to please God. Amid so many struggles, his spiritual life blossomed with a supernatural serenity. He spent long hours in silence before the crucified, shedding tears and interceding for his diocese. It was common to see him prostrate on the chapel floor, with his arms in the form of a cross, praying for sinners and asking for mercy for the world. Many considered him a mystic, and indeed his prayer was deep and transformative. He did not seek ecstasies or revelations, but intimate union with the heart of Jesus. He was aware that the true miracle is interior conversion. Therefore, his holiness did not manifest itself in external prodigies, but in the constancy and fidelity of each day. One of the most beautiful moments of his life occurred when, during a pastoral visit, an elderly priest tried to dissuade him from sleeping on the floor because of his weakness. Saint Charles replied tenderly, "Christ slept on the cross. I, who am his servant, cannot demand more comfort than my Lord had." This sentence, uttered with simplicity, reveals Borromeo's deeply Eucharistic and cruciform heart. He saw in everything an opportunity to conform himself to the Redeemer. His greatness lay precisely in this silent humility, which converted without speeches, solely by the witness of love lived. St. Charles's concern for the liturgy was equally noteworthy. He believed that the beauty of divine worship should reflect the majesty of God. He restored churches, standardized ceremonies, and insisted that the Mass be celebrated with dignity and recollection. He fought any sign of profanation or carelessness in celebrations. For him, the liturgy was the beating heart of Christian life, the place where heaven touches earth. He taught that every gesture before the altar must be a prayer. For this reason, he did not tolerate improvisations or irreverences. His devotion and liturgical zeal shaped the spiritual life of generations and profoundly influenced post-Tridentine spirituality. In his spiritual direction, St. Charles always emphasized the importance of frequent confession and worthy communion. He taught that the confessional is the throne of mercy, where Christ heals the wounds of sin. He encouraged his priests to hear confessions with patience and compassion, without ever trivializing sin. As for communion, he recommended that it be received with purity of heart and a clean conscience. He himself confessed regularly, and before celebrating Mass, he made long examinations of conscience. He said that the priest must purify himself to touch the Lord's body. His reverence for the sacraments was so intense that his mere presence inspired devotion among the faithful. The love that Saint Charles Borromeo nurtured for the cross was the axis of his entire spirituality. He used to say that the cross is the only road to heaven. During his homilies, he invited the people to embrace suffering with faith and hope, reminding them that Christ did not promise an easy life, but a glorious eternity. When he faced difficulties, he would kiss a small crucifix that he always carried with him and repeat, "Lord, thy will be done." This total surrender to the divine will made him a living example of obedience and abandonment. Nothing shook him, because everything he did was out of love. In his later years, he began to feel the weight of illnesses and the fatigue accumulated by a life of self-giving. Even so, he refused to slow his pace. "Rest is for heaven," he told those who advised him to stop. Until the end, he wanted to serve and love. His life had become a continual prayer, an offering that was slowly consumed like incense before the throne of God. The people saw him as a saint already in life. His preaching gathered crowds, his words converted, and his simple blessing was sought by thousands. He was already, without a doubt, one of the most luminous figures of the Catholic Church of his time. Throughout his entire journey, Saint Charles Borromeo showed that holiness is not the privilege of a few, but a universal vocation. He lived the radicality of the gospel amid the most demanding responsibilities, proving that it is possible to be holy without withdrawing from the world, provided the heart belongs entirely to God. His life was the perfect synthesis between action and contemplation, between prayer and work, between authority and humility. And that is why, centuries later, his example continues to inspire bishops, priests, and lay people to seek the same fidelity that made him one of the greatest reforming saints in the history of the Church. In the last years of his life, Saint Charles Borromeo radiated a serenity that only the saints possess. The intensity of his self-giving began to leave visible marks on his body. He was thinner, his face paler, his eyes more sunken, but his gaze burned with love for God. It was a fire that did not go out, even under the weight of illness. Those who lived with him said that his mere presence conveyed peace and transformed the atmosphere. It was as if the grace of God, which consumed him within, was reflected in every gesture, every word, and even in his silence. That austere and contemplative man who had spent his life reforming souls, now silently prepared for the definitive encounter with the Lord. The Eucharist continued to be the center of his existence. He celebrated Holy Mass with an indescribable reverence, each word spoken slowly, each gesture performed with absolute love. Often he would remain for hours in thanksgiving after the celebration, motionless, immersed in prayer before the tabernacle. Those who observed him had the impression that he was no longer on earth, but in communion with heaven itself. For him, the Mass was not a ceremony, but the real sacrifice of Calvary renewed before his eyes. Once, when warned by a doctor to rest and reduce his celebrations, he replied, "How can a priest rest from the altar? It is there that I find my strength and my repose." On his pastoral visits, Saint Charles made a point of carrying the Blessed Sacrament with him. In every village or city he visited, the first thing he asked for was an altar. He wanted Jesus in the Eucharist to be the center of every community. He taught the people the value of adoration and of the real presence, and he promoted holy hours that ended in tears and confessions. People rediscovered the love of God and returned to the sacraments. Many spiritual miracles were attributed to his intercession. Deep down, the greatest miracle was the conversion that sprang from the example of his life, lived entirely as a host offered in sacrifice. His humility remained impressive, even with his fame for holiness. The people venerated him, the popes respected him, the kings admired him, but he continued to consider himself a useless servant. He called himself the poor Bishop of Milan. He rejected titles and privileges and always preferred to be last in processions, walking in silence with the rosary in his hands. When someone praised him, he would reply, "Whatever good is in me is God's. What is mine are only miseries." This awareness of his smallness was the basis of his greatness. He knew that holiness is not the fruit of human merit, but of grace received with humility. His love of penance did not diminish over time, but intensified. Even sick, he continued practicing rigorous fasts, sleeping on a board covered with a simple blanket and wearing a cilice under his garments. He wanted to keep alive the flame of spiritual vigilance. He taught that the body must be the servant of the soul, not the other way around. This discipline, far from hardening him, made him more compassionate. He understood the suffering of others better because he experienced in himself pain and sacrifice. His penance was love. He did not seek suffering out of pride, but as a means of interceding for the people and repairing the offenses committed against God. As the years passed, his apostolic zeal inspired all of Italy. Other bishops began to follow his example, and dioceses that had once lived in spiritual neglect began to flourish. Saint Charles Borromeo became a reference for clergy and people alike. His reforms, once contested, were now admired and imitated. The Council of Trent had found in him the ideal executor of its decrees, the man who transformed conciliar words into concrete life. The Church saw in him a mirror of the Christian ideal: solid faith, firm morals, and ardent charity. His influence extended even to Rome, where he was considered one of the greatest pillars of Catholic renewal. Even amid so many responsibilities, he never withdrew from the life of prayer. At nightfall, he would withdraw to his chapel and spend hours in contemplation. Often the servants would find him still kneeling at dawn. His face, bathed in tears, reflected a love that consumed him. The silence of his prayers seemed to carry the weight of the world. He prayed for priests, for sinners, for the poor, and for the whole Church. He asked God for strength to persevere to the end, aware that the spiritual battle ends only with death. His interior life was a mystery of love and sacrifice, where the human and the divine were united in a sublime way. During an outbreak of plague, Saint Charles once again put his own life at risk. He went out into the streets, visited the infected, brought them the sacraments, and organized penitential processions. The civil authorities, fearing contagion, begged him to stay at home, but he replied, "A shepherd does not abandon his sheep when the wolf attacks." Thus he walked among the dying with a crucifix in his hands, blessing and consoling. The populace saw him as an angel sent by God. Even when he contracted a fever and was at death's door, he did not cease to pray for the sick. This episode definitively consolidated his fame for holiness among the people of Milan. The impact of his life went beyond the limits of the diocese. His correspondence with other bishops, religious and fervent laypeople was extensive and full of spiritual wisdom. In his letters, he spoke of the importance of fidelity, purity, prayer, and love for the Church. His words overflowed with meekness and firmness, compassion and truth. In one of them he wrote, "Nothing is more necessary to man than to learn to suffer with Christ, for he who suffers with him reigns with him." Jitim. This sentence expressed the synthesis of all his spiritual theology, suffering as a path of redeeming love and union with the Lord. In the last months of his life, St. Charles already felt that his mission was coming to an end. He gathered the clergy and people to exhort them to perseverance in the faith. He asked that they not stray from the truth and that they keep their zeal for holiness. He said that the Church needed burning hearts and faithful souls, willing to suffer for love of Christ. His final discourse, full of emotion, remained engraved in everyone's memory. "God gave me a flock, and now I ask it back of him. May the Lord be your true shepherd, as he has always been mine." Shortly afterward, his health worsened, and the great reformer began his last and most beautiful mission, to unite himself completely to his Lord in eternity. In the last days of his life, Saint Charles Borromeo could scarcely walk, but his soul remained vibrant, full of zeal and love. The signs of exhaustion were evident: a weakened body, shortness of breath, and the long nights of prayer now interspersed with intense fevers. Even so, he refused any comfort that would distract him from contemplation. He said that illness was a visit from God, and that through it, the Lord was preparing him for eternity. Doctors and attendants begged him to rest, but he replied calmly, "The shepherd must die standing beside the flock." This phrase, repeated with a trembling voice and eyes full of faith, marked those who accompanied him to the end. Understanding that the hour of meeting the Creator was near, St. Charles wished to make one final spiritual retreat. He withdrew to the College of the Oblates of St. John, a religious house that he himself had founded. There, in a small, austere room, without luxury and almost without furniture, he prepared for death as he had lived, in silence, penance, and prayer. He asked that they bring him the crucifix he had always carried with him and place it before his eyes. "There is my treasure," he said, pointing to the crucified Christ. His last week was marked by deep recollection. He prayed continually, offered his sufferings for the Church, and asked forgiveness of anyone he might have offended. It was the soul of a saint in full communion with heaven. As the days went by, the news of his illness spread through Milan and neighboring cities. Crowds gathered before the house where he lay, praying and weeping. The people whom he had loved and guided now repaid him with prayers and gratitude. Men, women, and children knelt in the streets, asking God to heal him, but also resigning themselves to his will. The name of Charles Borromeo, which had once echoed as a symbol of authority and reform, was now pronounced with filial tenderness. All Milan felt that it was about to lose not only an archbishop, but a spiritual father, a true friend of God. Even weak, Saint Charles continued celebrating Holy Mass, though he needed the aid of 2 priests to remain standing. Every word of the consecration came from his lips as a final offering. He wept before the altar, aware that he was saying farewell to earth through the same sacrifice that had consecrated his whole life. In those moments, his union with Christ reached its apex. After celebrating, he asked that the Blessed Sacrament be exposed in his cell. He wished to die before the Lord, contemplating the body of Christ that he had loved with all his strength. The last words heard from his lips were invocations of faith and love. Jesus, my Lord and my all. On November 3rd, 1584, around midnight, Saint Charles Borromeo gave his soul to God. He was only 46 years old, but he had lived as one who traverses a century in spiritual intensity. His death was serene, almost imperceptible. A faint smile remained on his face, as if he had glimpsed paradise. Those present fell to their knees and began to pray the Te Deum, not as a lament, but as thanksgiving. All Milan plunged into mourning, but also into deep veneration. The saint's body was kept in vigil for days, and the stream of faithful who came to pay him homage seemed endless. The city wept, yet it knew that an intercessor had been born in heaven. Pope Gregory XIII, upon receiving the news, exclaimed, "The Church has lost one of her greatest pillars." And in fact, Saint Charles had been the heart of the Tridentine reform, the model of the holy bishop, and the example of fidelity to the gospel in times of crisis. His body was buried in the Cathedral of Milan, the majestic Duomo, where it rests to this day. Thousands of miracles began to be attributed to his intercession soon after his death. The sick were healed, families reconciled, and sinners converted by invoking the name of the new saint. The fame of holiness spread rapidly, and soon all Europe referred to him as the Apostle of the Catholic Reformation. The holiness of Saint Charles Borromeo was not made of extraordinary visions or spectacular mystical phenomena, but of a constant and heroic fidelity to the will of God. His greatness lay in obedience and perseverance. He lived the gospel without reserve, serving with tireless love and absolute humility. His life was a silent preaching, a mirror of Christ the servant who gives himself to the end. Even in death, his example continued to teach, holiness is possible, even amid the heaviest responsibilities, when everything is done out of love for God and in union with Him. A few years after his death, the formal processes for his canonization began. Testimonies from priests, faithful, and even adversaries were gathered, all confirming his holiness and the power of his intercession. In 1610, Pope Paul V declared him a saint only 26 years after his death, one of the fastest processes in the history of the Church. The decree of canonization presented him as the perfect model of pastor, teacher, and servant of Christ. Since then, the name of Saint Charles Borromeo has been invoked throughout the Catholic world, especially by priests and bishops who see in him the ideal of their vocation. Devotion to Saint Charles spread quickly through Europe and the New World. Churches, monasteries, and educational institutions were dedicated to him. His image began to adorn temples and altars, always represented with a serene face, a crucifix in his hands, and his gaze turned to heaven. In every feature, one could see the serenity of a heart consumed by God. His liturgical feast was established for November 4th, and to this day it is celebrated with great solemnity, especially in Milan, where his incorrupt body continues to be a sign of divine fidelity. In every generation, he continues to inspire new pastors to follow the same path of love and sacrifice. The spiritual legacy of Saint Charles Borromeo transcends the centuries. He left the Church not only reforms and documents, but a living example of embodied holiness. He taught that fidelity to the gospel requires courage, that true authority is born of service, and that pastoral love is the soul of every reform. His life was a testimony that the Holy Spirit continues to act powerfully in history, raising up saints in times of darkness. Therefore, the figure of Saint Charles remains current, especially in times of spiritual crisis, reminding everyone that holiness is the only path capable of renewing the Church. The figure of Saint Charles Borromeo remains one of the most luminous in the history of the Church. Even centuries after his death, his spiritual presence remains alive at every altar, seminary, and priestly heart that seeks to serve God faithfully. What he accomplished in his short but intense life profoundly transformed the Catholic Church. His pastoral reform, his educational institutions, his dedication to catechesis, and his love for the poor left indelible marks. But above all, his greatest legacy was to have shown that true reform begins in the human heart when it surrenders itself entirely to the divine will. Saint Charles Borromeo was not merely a reformer of structures, he was a reformer of souls. The influence of Saint Charles crossed borders and centuries, becoming a universal example of priestly holiness. At a time when the world was distancing itself from the faith, he showed that holiness is not an option, but a vital necessity of the Church. His life inspired bishops, priests, and laypeople to understand that authority in the Church is not dominion, but service. The Holy Bishop of Milan became the symbol of the shepherd who loves with the heart of Christ and spends himself for the good of the flock. His unshakable fidelity to the gospel and to the ecclesial magisterium made him a reference for all times, especially when the Church faces doctrinal confusions and temptations of worldliness. The spirituality of Saint Charles Borromeo remains profoundly relevant. In a world that often values success and prestige, he reminds us that true greatness lies in serving humbly and loving unto sacrifice. His life invites us to look again to what is essential: prayer, penance, the Eucharist, charity, and obedience to the will of God. For him, holiness was not a theory, but a duty, a concrete path of imitation of Christ. His fidelity in small things, liturgy, study, care for the poor, and the formation of priests, teaches that Christian perfection is built in daily perseverance, in silence, and in continual self-giving. In the pastoral sphere, Saint Charles was the great apostle of the formation of the clergy. His example inspired the creation of seminaries throughout Europe and consolidated the model of priestly preparation that endures to this day. He understood that the priest must be not only learned but holy, not merely an eloquent preacher, but a man of prayer. This vision shaped the profile of the Catholic clergy for generations and became a solid basis for modern pastoral practice. In every priest faithful to his vocation, in every bishop who lives with simplicity and zeal, there is a reflection of the spirit of Saint Charles Borromeo, the man who loved the Church to the end. Beyond priestly formation, his example also reached the laity. He taught that all Christians are called to holiness, each according to his vocation. He encouraged fathers and mothers to raise their children in the faith, insisting that the family is the first seminary and the first altar. He taught that the Christian home should be a small church where one prays, forgives, and loves. This teaching, so simple and so profound, still echoes in the words of the contemporary magisterium. Thus, Saint Charles was a forerunner of an integral vision of Christian life, in which faith and daily life are united on the same path of salvation. Saint Charles Borromeo's love for the Church was total and unconditional. He loved her as mother and as the spouse of Christ, even when he saw her wounds and frailties. He never criticized the Church from the outside. He preferred to sanctify her from within through obedience and prayer. He taught that the Church is not reformed by rebellion, but by holiness. His witness is a living answer for all times of crisis. When the Church seems to weaken, God raises saints who, through fidelity and the cross, restore her original beauty. In Saint Charles, Providence showed that the true strength of the Church lies in grace, and that the most enduring reforms are those that are born from knees bent before the altar. Devotion to Saint Charles spread and strengthened over the centuries. Many later saints were inspired by his example. Among them, Saint Francis de Sales, Saint Alphonsus Liguori, and Saint John Mary Vianney. All saw in him a model of vigilant, humble, and zealous pastor. In churches dedicated to him throughout the world, the faithful invoke him as protector of youth, of priests, and of students. His name is linked to the idea of fidelity, purity, and spiritual fortitude. In every age, he is reborn as a prophetic voice, reminding the Church of the path of holiness and service. The figure of Saint Charles Borromeo also has a prophetic dimension for modern times. Amid secularization and the loss of the sense of the sacred, his witness invites Christians to return to the essentials of the faith. He reminds us that there is no authentic renewal without personal conversion, and that the Christian must be light in the world, even when this implies misunderstanding and sacrifice. His life teaches us that the cross is the true throne of the disciple of Christ, and that love is the only force capable of transforming the human heart. Saint Charles did not preach theories. He lived the gospel with heroic coherence. Today, as we contemplate his image before the altars, we see a man with a serene countenance, simple vestments, and a contemplative gaze. He reminds us that holiness is not the fruit of favorable circumstances, but of the decision to love God above all things. His witness is a perennial invitation to fidelity. In the face of so many voices that try to divert the Church from the path of truth, Saint Charles Borromeo is the echo of Christ's voice, calling his pastors and faithful to conversion, purity, and missionary ardor. He is, even today, a master of the Spirit, a sure guide for those who wish to follow the narrow way that leads to heaven. Thus ends the life and example of Saint Charles Borromeo, the tireless pastor, the holy reformer, the faithful servant of Christ. His existence was a canticle of love and obedience to God, a life consumed like a host before the altar. His death was merely the passage to eternal glory, where he continues to intercede for the Church he so loved. May his example continue to inspire the hearts of the faithful, and may his intercession obtain for us the grace to love the Church with the same zeal, to serve with the same humility, and to live with the same fidelity. May we all, in his imitation, be able to repeat with faith, "Lord, may I live and die for you as Saint Charles Borromeo lived and died."